A very good morning, guys. So hope you guys are doing great. Now today we are going to start with the physiology of central nervous system. So how many of you can hear me and how many of you can see the screen now? Just reply in the comment box so that I'll continue with the session. Can you hear me, guys? Okay, nice. So we'll start with the session. All right. So unlike the previous videos that has been posted already, we'll be continuing this time as integrated session of both the neuroanatomy from anatomy and the physiology of CNS together in the subsequent sessions, right? So it'll be in the morning session, 11 o'clock. All right. So today we are going to discuss about the introduction to the central nervous system, right? Important part in the body, right? That is the most important system in the body. And we all know the reason that it is the brain and the spinal cord which constitute the central nervous system, and they are the higher centers which control all the functioning in the body. So we regard them as the highest centers of the body. Okay. So fundamentally, CNS not just is important because they are the higher centers, they are also an important distinguishing aspect by which humans can be differentiated from the other lower animals, right? So in an evolutionary perspective, it is the CNS which reflects the progression in the human evolution. All right. Okay, so the picture that you're seeing here on the screen right now is that of a brain. So can you guys just say which part of this brain is creative and which part is logical? So this colored part is the creative one. So is it the right brain or the left brain which is creative? Okay, so we'll move on to the topic per se. So first we'll see about the organization of the central nervous system, right? So we'll see the organization of the central nervous system, that is how the CNS is constituted. Beyond telling that it is the brain and the spinal cord, we'll go to the next level to say what are the individual subdivisions of the central nervous system. So the first of all will be sensory system. We'll discuss about that separately, and then motor system, and finally the higher functions of the brain, right? So these are functions like learning, memory, speech, language, all such functions are regarded the higher functions of brain, and eventually we'll see about what is important for our exams. So this session is just going to be an orientation. So I'll just make you familiarized with the terms so that in the subsequent sessions, it will be easy for you to have a good understanding. All right, so coming to the organization, what you're seeing on the screen right now is showing the classification or the structural divisions of the nervous system. So we all know that nervous system is having two main components, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So what we are dealing now is the central nervous system. So what is there in the peripheral nervous system? It is nothing but all those nerves in the periphery that is beyond the spinal cord, and directly from the brain, it will be the cranial nerves. And here down there, we have the spinal nerves, right? And we have the autonomic nervous system, which also is regarded as a part of the peripheral nervous system. Now, in the central nervous system, we have got the brain on the superior aspect, the spinal cord is continuation below. So, brain, as we all know, it is made of the anterior-most forebrain, then midbrain, followed by the hindbrain. So, all of these, the anatomy will be discussed in the in the sessions of anatomy. So, we just have to know that in physiology, it is the brain and the spinal cord which form the main components of the central nervous system. Then we have got a different perspective or a different basis by which we divide the central nervous system again. So we'll see that in a couple of minutes. But before that, I want you all to know one more important thing about the central nervous system, not just the central nervous system, the entire nervous system. So the basic functional and structural component of the nervous system is, so you all guys know that. What is the most fundamental, structural and functional component of the nervous system? It is that picture which you're seeing here. Can you name this? It's very basic. What is this? Yes, very good, Shiva. This is neuron. All right. So it is neuron, which is the basic functional structural component. All right. Now, I'll just brush up those important structures here in the neuron. So we all know that the neuron has two important parts, the cell body and the axon. The cell body, otherwise called as the cyton, and the longer projection from the cell body is regarded as the axon. So those shorter projections which are arising from the cell body are called dendrites. And the axon terminates as small branches which form synapses with the adjacent neurons, right? So that is synapse. So what is a synapse? It is the junction or the connection between two different neurons. Okay, so that's about the neuron. Now what you're seeing on the right side is a more detailed explanatory picture of the neuron. All right, so here you can appreciate these blue colored ones called as the myelin sheath, okay, based on which we divide neurons into the myelinated and the unmyelinated nerve fibers. All right, okay, so what I want you to concentrate here is look at the synapse. So this is synapse. This is a very important question for you in exam, a 10 mark also. So this will be elaborated in a separate topic. Now just know the important things about synapse. So in a synapse, what is it? It is the ending of a nerve, that is a neuron. So in synapse, we have certain round bodies within the synapse called as the synaptic vesicles. Okay. So synaptic vesicles are the structures which contain some liquid substance in them called neurotransmitters. Okay. So these neurotransmitters are released when a neuron is stimulated. So where are these neurotransmitters released into? They are released into a space called the synaptic cleft. So in the synaptic cleft, the neurotransmitters are released, and these will then further go and bind to the receptors present on the adjacent neuron. So we call that adjacent neuron as the postsynaptic terminal. Okay, right? So those receptors get bound to these neurotransmitters. Further on, the stimulus is continued. So this is actually the representation of a chemical synapse. Okay. So synapses, we have so many classification. Fundamentally, there are two different classifications called electrical synapse and the chemical synapse. So what you're seeing here is the combination. So here it is a chemical synapse actually because of the involvement of the neurotransmitters here. So what happens? The neuron is stimulated by some electrical impulse, right? That electrical impulse is transferred through the axon, and this causes release of neurotransmitters in the cleft. These neurotransmitters get bind to the receptors on the adjacent neuron, causing the transduction of another electrical impulse. So that's about a synapse. Okay. Now we mentioned that there is something called as Neurotransmitters. So what are neurotransmitters? So neurotransmitters are chemical substances which are released by the neurons, and that causes transduction of impulses, right? So they are released in the synapses. We have got again different classification for neurotransmitters, but I'll just mention the basic one. Neurotransmitters can be inhibitory, they can be stimulatory, or they can be both inhibitory and stimulatory. Okay. So here are the examples: glutamate, aspartate, and then we have got GABA and glycine. And finally, dopamine, adrenaline. These are neurotransmitters which act as both excitatory and inhibitory. So what happens is when an excitatory neurotransmitter is released in the synaptic cleft, that will cause the production of EPSP, that is excitatory post-synaptic potential. Okay, I'm just familiarizing you with the terms so that it will be easy for you in the subsequent classes where this will be dealt in detail. All right. There's another term called neuromodulators. What are these? These are very different from the neurotransmitters because neurotransmitters cause production of EPSP, that is excitatory postsynaptic potential, or IPSP, that is inhibitory postsynaptic potential. But neuromodulators, they never cause such a direct action. These are also released by neurons, but these will cause a modulation as the name implies. So what sort of modulation? Either they will increase the inhibitory activity of some other neurotransmitter or decrease the activity of some other inhibitory neurotransmitter, right? So it's going to modulate the activity of a previously released neurotransmitter. This includes examples like neuropeptide Y, endorphin, and substance P. There's another term called neurohormones. So as the name implies, neurohormones are hormones released by the neurons. So most of you might be knowing it. Neurohormones, the best example is the one which is released by hypothalamus. The releasing hormones of hypothalamus, like the thyrotropin releasing hormone or the corticotropin releasing hormone, etc. So that's about the neurotransmitters. So now, initially we saw that the nervous system is divided into central nervous system and PNS. In the CNS, we saw that brain and spinal cord are the important components. Now, what are we going to see? The physiological classification of the CNS. Okay. So based on the functional perspective, we divide the CNS into three different levels. Okay. The first and the topmost level is called the higher brain or the cortical level. So that includes the cerebrum. Coming down, we have got the lower brain or the subcortical level. Why is it cortical and subcortical? Cortical refers to the cortex of the cerebrum. Subcortical is just below the cortical level. All right. So the subcortical level includes the structures like midbrain, pons, medulla. So together, these three constitute the brain stem. Okay. And along with that, we have got the cerebellum, which also forms the subcortical level. And additionally, the ones which are not shown in this picture are thalamus, hypothalamus, and the basal ganglia. So together, there are 7 structures which form the lower brain: midbrain, pons, medulla, cerebellum. Then we have got basal ganglia, thalamus, and hypothalamus. All right, coming down to the spinal cord level. So we know just behind, or I mean just below the medulla, we have got the spinal cord. So that has got 3 parts: the cervical part, then comes the thoracic part, and the lumbar. Down that we have the sacral, and the lowermost part is the coccygeal part. So these 5 together constitute the spinal cord, right? So we divided them based on the nerves arising from these spinal cord, right? Okay, so these are the 3 levels you need to know. And based on the functional aspect, purely based on the functional aspect, we are also dividing the CNS into 3 other categories called the central nervous system is divided into 3 other categories, as you can see here. The first is the sensory system. Okay, sensory system, then motor system, and finally the higher centers, the ones which perform the higher functions of the brain. So sensory system, as we all know, sensory system is nothing but the afferent system. Afferent means it is taking the impulses from periphery to the brain. Motor system will take the impulses from brain to the periphery. So we call the motor system otherwise as the efferent system. Then we've got the higher centers. So these three are not independent systems, okay? So all the three function together in a coordinated manner so that all the functions in the body are normal, okay? So this coordinated activity is very important. While talking about the coordinated activity, there's one more thing to mention here. Even the higher brain, lower brain, and the spinal cord, all the three are functioning in a coordinated manner, okay? So how is that? It is the cortex which performs the functions of memory and all those higher activities, right? So it is mainly regarded as the information carrying center. That is, cerebral cortex is the information carrying center. And the subcortical level, you can remember its function as just with the starting letters. Subcortical performs subconscious functions, okay? Subconscious functions, which means like when you're breathing, you're not all the time breathing consciously. So you're unconsciously breathing. So we cannot say it's unconscious, it is subconscious breathing, right? So all such activities which are not under the direct voluntary stimulus are regarded subconscious activities. So those subconscious functions are performed by subcortical level. Okay, so how is these two interdependent? So cortex is the center which carries information. So this cortex will give information to the subcortical level to perform the subconscious activities. But the cortex will act or function only when it is awake, which means when I am awake, I'm able to perform certain voluntary activities, right? So the cortex is a center which is active when we are awake. So how to make the brain awake? That is, how do we all get up in the morning? We hear some alarm sound or we hear some other noise and naturally we wake up, right? So how is this waking up actually stimulated in the brain? There's one important thing called the reticular activating system, okay? Remember this word, reticular activating system. It will come again when you learn about sleep, okay? Reticular activating system. This RAS is actually a part of the subcortical level. This is the network of nerve fibers which causes the stimulation of the cortex, right? So that is how we wake up in the morning. So now again, you know, whenever somebody asks you how did you wake up in the morning, you don't say I woke up by hearing the alarm sound. You can also say I woke up because my reticular activating system got stimulated, okay? Right. So that is about the organization of the central nervous system. Now let us see in detail about the sensory system, motor system, and the higher functions. So here let us see about the sensory system. What is sensation? We all know that it is a colloquial term as well. So sensation is nothing but it is that perception that you receive based on some stimulus from outside or from within the body. Like outside in the sense when somebody calls you, you are hearing a sound, right? So the sound is the stimulus and that gives you a sensation of hearing. Then when somebody touches you, you feel somebody is calling you, or maybe somebody touches you, you feel some sensation, that is touch sensation. So again, that is also a type of sensation. Now there's another type where for example, when you're hungry, you get some sort of, you know, hunger contractions, not exactly hunger contractions, you feel some sort of irritation or disturbance in the abdomen, right? So that is also a sort of stimulus, but this time the stimulus is arising from the body itself. So we call these as the visceral sensations, okay? So just keep these three examples in mind. One is you're hearing some noise, somebody is calling you. Second is somebody is touching you, you're feeling some sensation, that is touch. And thirdly, we said when you're hungry, you feel some sensation in the abdomen, right? So that is a visceral sensation. So based on these three examples, you can just revise this tabular column or the classification. So sensations, we divide them as general and special senses. Special senses, hearing comes under special senses. Why? Because these are sensations which are directly controlled by the brain by means of the cranial nerves, right? So this includes the vision, smell or olfaction, auditory, taste or gustation, and there's something called special proprioception. That is the vestibular function. This vestibular apparatus in the ear which helps in balancing the body, that also comes under the special senses. So the general senses, coming to that, we've got two groups here as the somatic group and the visceral group. So what is the visceral group? You should remember, when you're hungry. Hungry, you're getting some stimulus, right? So that is a sort of visceral sensation. But to be more precise, the baroreceptors and the chemoreceptors. What is baroreceptors? So you guys might be knowing baro means pressure. So this pressure receptors are the ones which they take the impulse from the blood vessels so that the blood pressure in the vessels is maintained. Okay. So baroreceptors are found in the blood vessels. So these are impulses or stimulation which is obtained or produced by the body itself. Then chemoreceptors are the ones which they sense the chemical substances found in the blood. So again, these are also found in the blood vessels. What they do is they will sense the level of oxygen perfusion, I mean the partial pressure of oxygen and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood vessels, so that when you undergo hypoxia, you are fainting, and that hypoxia causing fainting is because of these chemoreceptors, right? Okay, now under the somatic sensation, we've got superficial and deep. So superficial are nothing but when somebody touches you, that's superficial. When somebody gives a pressure on you, like somebody touches with some force, that's again superficial. Then temperature, that is warm or cold, that is also superficial. Then we've got the pain sensation, that's again superficial. Now there can also be deep pain. Then there can be proprioception, okay, the general proprioception. Proprioception is nothing but position sense. So when I'm sitting here, I know that I'm sitting here in front of my laptop, so that I have an orientation that I'm right now in this position. My body is right now in an upright position. But when I lie down, my body again knows that I'm flat. So when I'm flat, I know that I'm flat because I have proprioceptors. Okay, so proprioceptors are the ones which take up the information of position of the body. Okay, so that is about the different types of sensation we have, right? Okay, now we are telling that we are sensing this, the stimulus is coming and we are sensing it. How is it actually happening? So fundamentally, going to the deeper perspective, it is the receptor which carries or which takes the stimulus and converts that or transduces that into some other form of impulse. That is like sound is getting converted into electrical impulse, or anything, any stimulus that comes from exterior or from interior, they get converted into the form of impulse called as the electrical impulse. Okay, so this main function of transduction is performed by the sensory receptors. And again, this transduction activity of sensory receptors is an important short note for you, which will be dealt in the separate session. Okay, so now just get an orientation of the types of the sensory receptors. So we have 2-3 different classifications of sensory receptors. Now let's see the basic version. We divide these two into extro and intro receptors. As the name implies, we know it is from the exterior or from the interior aspect. So extro receptors, we divide them into telereceptors and cutaneous receptors. So what is telereceptor? Tele means from some distance, right? So all those special senses receptors, like for hearing, we have got receptors. Then for sight, like the rods and cones. Then for taste, we have taste buds. So actually taste buds wouldn't come here in this category, but sound and hearing, hearing and the sight, all these come under the telereceptors. Then cutaneous receptors are the ones which sense the fine touch or crude touch, pain, temperature, right? All those superficial ones will be sensed by the cutaneous receptors. Then visceral receptors. So what are visceral? Visceral are nothing but the internal organs. So the senses or the stimulus created from the internal organs are sensed by visceral receptors, like the baroreceptors and the chemoreceptors. Then we have got another group called the proprioceptors, or the receptors which sense the proprioception or position of the body. Okay, so now what have we seen? We have seen about the sensory receptors. Okay, so what have we seen? We have seen the sensory receptors. So sensory receptors are picking up the stimulus and they are transducing them into electrical impulses. Now, further on, this impulse has to be carried to the brain, right? So this is one very simple thing, just a logical idea. Something is sensed by the receptors. That impulse has to be sent to the brain. How will it go? From the site of sensing, it will go to the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord, through the spinal cord, it will go and reach the brain, okay? And it will reach the respective site. If it is sensory, it will go and reach the sensory cortex, okay? So we are going to see about those tracts or those pathways by which the sensory impulses are carried, okay? We call them as the ascending tract. Why ascending tract? It goes from below upwards, okay? All right. So look at this diagram. What I'm highlighting now is the receptor part, okay? So this is the receptor part. Now from the receptor part, the impulse has been generated. So from the receptor part, this generator will carry the impulses via first degree neurons, okay? Just remember these three. In the detailed session in the subsequent lectures, you will be knowing about what is the extent of these first degree, second degree and all. Now just remember, from the sensory receptors through the first degree neurons, the impulse is carried, and via the spinal cord, it goes along the second degree neurons. Then as it reaches thalamus, it becomes third degree neurons. So the third degree neurons are the last level, okay, or the final level, which will reach this sensory cortex, okay? So to be more precise, we call this as the somatosensory area, okay? Why somatosensory area? Because as I mentioned you, if you see here, this part, okay, this is the somatic sensation. So the sensations coming under the somatic subdivision are called the somatosensory impulses, okay? So these impulses are sensed by the somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex, and we are not going to deal about the special senses now, okay? So let's just leave that aside. It's a separate session. Now we are focusing on the somatosensory impulses, okay? So eventually the senses reach the impulses reach the somatosensory areas or the somasthetic areas. All right. So what you're seeing here is the list of ascending tracts, okay? Ascending tracts are nothing but the ones which carry impulses from below upwards, okay? So you have to remember two important words here, okay? There are so many tracts, like some about 10 tracts are there, 10 ascending tracts, but you should definitely know two important tracts. One is the posterior column, okay? The posterior column. The other is anterolateral column, or separately you can call it anterior and the lateral column, okay? These are the two important and ascending tracts. So for now, just keep that in your mind. And regarding the other tracts, all those names are very simple. See, we said that it is going from below upwards, which means it is going from spinal cord to the brain. So from the spinal cord, that's why it's spino. So everything is starting as spinocerebellar, spino-olivary, and spinoreticular. So from the spinal cord to the cerebellum, it's spinocerebellar. From the spinal cord to the olivary nucleus, we call it spino-olivary. From spinal cord to the reticular fibers, as I mentioned you, that will be called as spinoreticular. Okay. So for now, you need to remember these two important tracts, the posterior column and the anterolateral tract. The anterolateral tract is otherwise called as the spinothalamic tract. You have to remember these two important tracts. I'll ask a question on this shortly. So just keep that in mind, the name of those two important ascending tracts. Okay. Now what you're seeing here is the somatosensory area, as I mentioned you before. Okay, we've got two different areas, okay, two different areas in the cerebral cortex. So the somatosensory area 1 is as marked here. This is the region. And the somatosensory area 2 is taking impulses from the leg, arm and the face. So it's from the limbs and the face. All those sensory impulses, cutaneous impulses, reach the leg, arm and the face, okay? But other sensations, so the impulses from hands, fingers, okay? Hands, fingers, shoulders, Then from the neck and other regions, it's going to reach the somatosensory area 1, right? So just know the location where they are present. All right. So can you guys name this picture that you're seeing on your screen now? I think some of you might be knowing. Can you name this particular picture? It has one unique name. Do you guys know the name of this particular structure? Okay, it is actually called as the homunculus. Okay, yeah, it will be a new term for you. Homunculus. What is homunculus? This particular picture, can you appreciate that there are parts of the body here on the outline? This is hand, this is the facial part, okay, and here this is the leg, okay. So this particular diagram, what you can appreciate is the cortex. So this is the cortex, the cerebral cortex, okay, and around the cerebral cortex there is pictures of, or the drawing of the parts of the body, okay. So why do we have this diagram? What is the purpose of this picture, and how do we actually define homunculus? So it is good if you know this definition. So see, this is having different parts on different areas, right? So this is not in a uniform pattern. So this is the distorted representation of the human body, right? It's the distorted representation of the human body, and we can call this a neurological map. So it is a distorted representation of human body based on the neurological map of areas, okay, areas of the brain that are dedicated for the processing of impulses from these parts of the body. Okay, can you get a clarity? What you're seeing here is the cerebral cortex. Over that we have the pictures, we have the drawing of distorted parts of the body. So what we need to know is the area of the cerebral cortex that is receiving impulses from the particular area of the body. Say for example, look at here we have got face, okay. So from the face there are impulses arising from the face. All these impulses reach this particular part of the cerebral cortex, okay, and relatively it is greater than what is dedicated to the hand, okay. So you can see more specifically it is the lips which is dedicated a huge area in the cerebral cortex, okay. So this diagram, what it actually depicts is the density of neurons or the density of receptors present, and at the same time it shows the precision of activity by each of these structures. Say for example, we know very well our hand has the capability of performing the fine motor activities, like when we are writing, when we are painting something, it is the fine motor activity. So this fine motor activity is a very complicated function. So a greater part of the cerebral cortex is dedicated for this function itself, okay. But similarly, if you take the hand, if you take the upper limb itself, when you see the elbow, the area which is dedicated for the sensation received from the elbow is very less. It's here, okay, just very less. Why? Because we don't have any such complicated fine motor activity or fine sensory perception from these areas, right? So this diagram is a depiction to show how much area and proportion of the cerebral cortex is dedicated for receiving and processing the impulses from a particular part of the body. So this particular diagram is homunculus of the sensory system, okay. It's otherwise called the sensory homunculus, okay. So next we'll move on to the motor system. So again, just to brush up of the thing which we have seen in the sensory system, we said it is from the sensory receptor the impulses are sensed, that is stimulus is sensed and that is transduced to the electrical impulse, This electrical impulse was carried by the nerves, first degree, second degree, third degree neurons through the spinal cord, and it then reached the somatosensory area of the cortex, right? So up to this, is it clear, guys? Are you clear with this sensory system? Okay, so similarly, now we'll move on to the motor system. Okay, so what is motor system? It is exactly opposite to that which you have seen now. So in sensory, we came from below upwards. Now we will go from above downwards. So which means we'll start from the brain. Okay, from the brain, that is from the motor part of the, or the motor area of the cerebral cortex, we can start. So here what you're seeing is the cerebral cortex showing the motor area and the sensory area separately. Okay, so this is the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex. And we have got the supplementary area and a premotor area. Okay, all concerned with the motor system. Now previously we saw that there is somatic area. Okay, it's just behind the sensory, motor area. Just posterior to the motor area, we have got the somatic or somatosensory area. All right. So the picture that you see on your right side now, what is it? It is the homunculus again. But here this homunculus is specifically called as the motor homunculus. So motor homunculus, what we can appreciate here, look at here, this is the face. So for face, a greater contribution is there in the cerebral cortex. Similarly, for the hand, can you appreciate that it is such a big area which is dedicated for the hand in the brain, in the cerebral cortex? Why? Because of the fine motor activity. It's a very complicated thing. So for processing the information for the fine motor functions, a greater area has to be dedicated in the cerebral cortex. So that is shown in the diagram. And similarly, even in the face, it is the vocal part which is given a greater contribution. Okay, the vocal part. The reason is vocalization is also a higher motor activity. Okay, it's a complicated thing. So that is also dedicated a greater area and proportion in the cerebral cortex. Okay. So here what you need to remember is the word homunculus. All right. So, one question for you. Previously, I mentioned you that in the ascending tract, there are two important structures or the two important tracts you need to remember. So can you guys name those tracts now? I mentioned two important tracts that you should remember. Can you name those tracts? Yes, one is dorsal column. What is the other one? The dorsal column is otherwise called the posterior column. So what's the other one? Yes, so it is the posterior column and the anterolateral column. So these are the two important tracts you need to remember. Yep, very good. So it is otherwise called the spinothalamic tract. The anterolateral is otherwise called spinothalamic tract. So if you retain this much, it is very, very good. So what you need to remember in ascending tract, the dorsal column or the posterior column, then the anterolateral tract or the spinothalamic tract. Okay, very good. So now we are going to see the descending tract, just opposite to the ascending tract. So ascending came from the sensory receptor to the cortex. So now we are going from the cortex to the motor areas. That is, we are going to reach the muscles. Okay. So here what you need to remember is, similarly like how we saw two important tracts there, here you need to remember the pyramidal tract and the extrapyramidal tract. Okay. So it's very simple here, right? Simply we can say pyramidal and the others are coming under extrapyramidal. So what is this pyramidal tract? It is otherwise called corticospinal tract. I mentioned it is CST. It is the corticospinal tract. Okay. So why do we call it as pyramidal tract? It is because of the reason that the corticospinal, that is the fibers from the cortex to the spinal cord, they cross via a structure called pyramid in the brainstem. Okay. So that is why we call this as the pyramidal tract. So fundamentally, you need to remember this name. Okay, this basic name, the corticospinal tract. And the other tract is the extrapyramidal tract. So extrapyramidal includes all other tracts which do not go crossing the pyramid of the brain are called as the extrapyramidal tract. Okay. So this includes rubrospinal, tectospinal, reticulospinal. So as I mentioned you in the ascending tract, here it's the same. It comes from different areas of the cortex, different areas in the brain, but eventually it all goes to the spinal cord. So the suffix is spinal, it is fixed, but the prefix gets changed. Okay. So that's what you need to know. So rubrospinal tract is coming from the red nucleus. That's why it's rubrospinal tract. And there's another tract called the corticobulbar tract. It is good if you know this also. But basically, you should remember the pyramidal or the corticospinal tract and the extrapyramidal tracts. All right. So this is a pictorial depiction of how these fibers are arising. So they're starting from the cortex. They go via the internal capsule and then goes down. All right. So then they eventually get divided into two parts as the anterior and the lateral part. So that's why we give two names for it, the lateral and the anterior corticospinal tract. So what you're seeing here is a picture showing the different tracts. Okay, so the one which I mentioned you important is that which is important is the corticospinal tract. So you can see it's arising from the cortex to the spinal cord. All right. Okay, so that's about the motor system. Now, what is left out? We have to see the higher functions and others. So under higher functions, what will be discussed in detail, which I'm going to give a short review, a preview of it. These are the ones. So it is learning and memory, okay? Learning and memory. So we are all fond of this thing, right? Memory. We all have this trouble since our school days. I forget something as I go to the exam hall. All right, so everybody faces the situation. So we want to know how this memory is actually formed in the brain, right? So I'll just mention one word which can define memory for you. It is nothing but synapse. Okay, so whenever you remember memory or whenever you think of memory, remember it is the synapse which is responsible for the building up of memory. Okay, so memory is formed because of formation of synapse, and if the synapse is strengthened, it forms a long-term memory. If the synapse is not stimulated again and again, then that memory fades off. That's called the short-term memory. Okay, so if you're forgetting something, which means the synapse that you had formed when you read it for the first time has been faded off. The synapse has been degenerated. So revision strengthens the synapses. Okay, so keep that in mind so that you keep revising. As you keep revising, you can remember things for a longer time. All right, the second function is behavior and the association of limbic system with it. So here is a diagram of showing the limbic system. Okay, so any behavior or habit that we develop is because of this functioning of the limbic system. So we would have heard of this one familiar thing called 21-day plan. So whenever we do something continuously for 21 days, this gets converted into a behavior of us, right? So being in the quarantine, if you don't read continuously for 21 days, then your brain will forget what exactly is it to read. Okay, so let's not make it a habit. So just for a while, even if you're not feeling like studying for long hours, just take a book or take something that you can read, okay, and keep this practice of reading something or the other for at least 1 hour a day, so that you don't lose this habit of reading. Okay, and also writing too. Okay, then coming to speech. So speech is also a very important higher function, because we saw in the motor homunculus that vocalization is given a huge area in the cerebral cortex, right? Then sleep. So sleep, I told you to remember one word when we talk about sleep. What is that word? I mentioned that it is the word, it is that particular system which helps us to wake up in the morning. Can you remember that? I mentioned it as an abbreviation as RAS. Can you expand that? What is RAS? Then we have got to see about ECG, and finally we'll discuss about the CSF and the blood-brain barrier. Okay, those will be covered in the last topics. Okay, very good people. So that is reticular activating system. The reticular activating system is the one which wakes us up in the morning. Yep. Okay. So I've just given a gist of everything here. All of these will be dealt as separate sessions for you. Okay, so keep a follow-up of all the sessions that will be dealt in the morning, 11 a.m. It will be integrated with an anatomy. Okay, so if you keep a follow-up, it will be easy for you guys to learn it easier and for a good retention too. Because usually when you learn something, we will be learning it like anatomy separately and physiology separately. But this time we have tried to make it integrated so that you learn neuroanatomy and the physiology of CNS at the same time. Okay, it'll help you for a better retention. Okay. So these are the important questions under the CNS physiology. Okay. So today I've not discussed anything about these organs. I mean, this particular structures in the brain, like cerebellum or the basal ganglia. So those will be dealt as separate sessions. Okay. Thalamus, hypothalamus, all of these will be dealt in separate sessions. Okay. So these are the list of important 10-mark questions, and here is the list of important short notes for you. So after completing all the important structures, finally we'll be having a separate session on the lesions in the brain stem or lesions in the spinal cord. Okay, like the thalamic syndrome, which is a lesion caused in the thalamus, then decerebrate rigidity, Parkinson's associated with basal ganglia, then Brown-Sequard syndrome. Okay, so this is about the introduction of the CNS physiology. Hope you guys understood what has been discussed today. So keep a follow-up of all the sessions, guys, so that you can learn it as we have a discussion here. Okay, so if you have any doubts regarding the introduction topic, you can put it in the comment box and we'll reply for that. Okay, thank you, guys. Just keep in mind, you need to keep studying each day. Otherwise, your limbic system will not help you read when you want to read during your exams. Okay, yeah, thank you. And guys, today evening we'll be having a live session, right? So that will be a discussion on the stress management and peer pressure. So you can attend that by 6 o'clock. Okay. Yep. It will be taken by Siddharth. Yeah. Thank you.